name is Jasmine Sky, and I'm here today with another NaNoWriMo writing advice video, kind of. Also kind of an announcement. You may have noticed that I have not posted my latest writing vlogs for Nano. And my last vlog was all about me struggling to get my word count in, though I do think I ended that vlog on a hopeful note, but after that vlog, when I started the next vlog and attempted to keep writing my desert fantasy that I was working on, I realized some things, and that's what this video is going to be about, which is how to know when a book is just not ready. Because that happens. It's not just you being lazy. I mean, it can be just you being lazy. I've certainly had that before, but there are circumstances when a book is just not ready. You're just not in the place where you can write it, either with your own skills or you haven't figured out enough about the book. And that's what we're gonna talk about today. So I'm gonna give you what I believe are the 3 main elements of a book that you need to have in order to properly draft it. And then we're gonna talk a little bit about what went wrong with my desert fantasy and what I'm gonna be doing instead. But first, let's talk a little bit more generally. Please keep in mind, I am an outliner, I am not a pantser, and I'm gonna sound maybe a little bit, this is the only way in this video, but there are certainly people who are really good at pantsing who can know almost nothing about a project and still finish a draft, and that's them. I don't think that's many people. I think there's only a small subset of people, and I think most pantsers still know these 3 elements that I'm going to talk about, at least some aspects of them. So let's get into that. The first element is your characters. Now, you don't have to know your side characters. Most people don't when they're going into a messy first draft. It can be helpful to have a list of names and, relationships and what side characters may or may not do, but it's just as common for you to come up on a scene in your messy first draft and be like, I need a character for this role, and then just create them on the spot. The thing I think you do need when you're writing a first draft is your main character and your antagonist. Those 2 are the pivotal people of a story, and you specifically need to know their motivations, what propels them through the plot, because that's going to be how you have momentum in your draft. If you're struggling with your main character or your primary antagonist and don't really understand them yet, even just in the broadest sense of what makes them want to do what they do, you might struggle with drafting this story at this point in time. Now, the second element is your plot. This is the most typical thing that people are like, you pants, so therefore you don't have your plot outlined. Sure, but as I talked about in my tips for outlining for NaNoWriMo video, which I will link down below, I do think that even pantsers need to know the major plot beats of their draft in order to successfully do that first draft, especially in a condensed timeline like Nano. And this doesn't need to be a ton of the plot points, just things like the inciting incident, maybe a couple aspects of the try-fail cycle, and the climax in broad strokes. For people who are more outliners, you might want more of those. Like for me, if I don't have a solid outline of the Save the Cat beat sheet or the hero's journey or something, that I don't start writing a book. But that really depends on where you sit on the spectrum of being a pantser versus an outliner, right? But either way, I believe you need to have at least a little bit of the plot figured out to successfully draft a novel. And then the third and final element, in my opinion, is the world. So these are things like your setting, time period, religion, magic system, political system. There's a lot of things that go into world that vary depending on if it's like a contemporary story versus a fantasy versus a sci-fi, space opera, historical. But even in a contemporary story, knowing your setting is super important. Knowing your time of year is super important. And similarly in fantasies, historicals, and sci-fis, etc. You need to know all those things, but then also need to know more things outside of that, that if you don't know, can be very, very difficult to do the draft. And this is where I think it's especially important when you're writing like a fantasy or a sci-fi or some sort of speculative fiction story, that if you don't have some of the world planned out beforehand, then naturally we fall back on stereotypes. And this is how we get like the very basic medieval fantasy European story that's like not even historically accurate to actual Middle Ages Europe, but is like what has become the trope of what it was in fantasy. It's overdone and it's not as interesting as other things you could do. So having a little bit more of your world planned out before you start writing means that you can be a little bit more inventive, and then you can still figure stuff out about your world as you're writing, as is the case with all of these things, but you're building off of a really strong base instead of trying to make something out of nothing in that fast, messy first drafting process. So those are the three elements. Now, I was working on my desert fantasy, as you know if you've been following my channel, and I had my desert fantasy planned out, I thought, really well. I've been working on this novel for over 2 years now, at least in terms of trying to figure stuff out about it. I love my main characters. I know a lot of my side characters even, so I think the character aspect was really set. In terms of the plot, major plot beats have been planned out from the get-go. That's the reason I started writing this story, is because of the climax and what I want to do with the climax. And in terms of the smaller plot beats, I was a little more vague on some of them, but as I was starting to draft and I came up across them, I figured them out pretty easily. So the plot, I think, was not the problem. What I realized was the issue is that I wasn't having fun while I was writing that book. And I sat down and I was like, okay, what isn't fun about this book? Like I said, liked the characters, liked the main romantic relationship I was building for, liked the plot, like those things were fine, were fun. But for me, I'm the kind of writer that when I'm doing that messy first draft, if I am a little low energy or kind of stuck on a scene, then I always fall back on writing something related to the world. I will fall back on setting description or musings about the magic system, those kinds of info dumpy stuff that I have to then cut in later drafts. But that's how I get through my first draft, is I muse on my world. And that's what I realized I was missing with my desert fantasy. I like the setting a lot. I like the desert fantasy setting, and I think the way that I've set up like the villages and the kingdom is good, and I like it. I like the magic system. I do wonder if I need to bring it up a little bit more in intensity. It's perhaps my least magical magic system that I've ever tried to write, so that might be the issue. Or maybe I need to add a little bit more spice around the magic system. Like maybe I need to spruce up the political system even more. Maybe I need to add a stronger religious component to it. There's a bunch of things I can do to make the world more exciting. But the thing is, I just don't know what the best path for this book is yet. I could randomly choose one and go with it, but if I decide later that it wasn't right, then I'll just have wasted that drafting time. And I'm at the point in my writing career where I think it's really important to draft the things that I know are going to be pretty solid, so then it doesn't take me as long to do later revisions because I want to sell books, right? So I did decide that I needed to set my desert fantasy aside and let it percolate in the back of my head again, like it did for the past 2 years. I said in my vlogs, I tried to write this book 2 years ago, something was missing, I set it aside. The thing that was missing actually was an aspect of the plot as related to later in the series, like the political situations that will affect books 2 and 3 weren't figured out when I tried that very first draft 2 years ago, and I figured those out for this draft, and they're a lot stronger, and that's why I think the plot is much more ready. But what I've realized I'm still missing is something to do with the world, and figuring that out will inherently, in a good book, everything weaves together, so inherently it will tweak the plot, the characters, and stuff like that, and that's okay because I feel like I could step it up. I could step up some more things related to my character relationships or my character motivations, and I could step up some more things related to my plot or my subplots, etc. So yeah, I'm gonna let it sit. I'm gonna let it percolate. Hopefully at some point something, 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years down the line, something will click and I'll realize what it was that was missing, and then I will have it and I will be able to finally finish that draft of my desert fantasy. But until then, it just needs to sit. So I need a different project to work on. Now, unfortunately, I'm not gonna win Nano this year. I fell too far behind and it's not worth the stress to try to win. I'm gonna talk about that in my next writing vlog, but I will continue to do writing vlogs for my next project. They just won't be NaNoWriMo writing vlogs, they'll just be writing vlogs, which is fine. It's that kind of year. So my quick announcement is that I am writing a space fantasy. It is, think Treasure Planet, the movie, meets Ancillary Justice, that trilogy. So it's like pirates in fantasy space, but also military sci-fi kind of mashed together, and it's very gay. Like everything I write is very gay, across the spectrum of gay, not just gay. And I really like it. I love the world, I love the plot, I love the characters, and when I sat down, after I decided to set aside my desert fantasy, I sat down to like finish flushing out the characters and their motivations and the plot and everything. It just flowed so much easier. Just the actual putting together of my notes that I had on this novel and the outlining. I created a very, very detailed 40 scene outline that I was like, this is so much easier than what I was trying to do with the desert fantasy. It's still an adult novel, but it's only a standalone, so that helps in terms of the complexity of the plot, I think, and what I have to set up for, because it all needs to be contained into that single story. But I love the characters. I adore the world. The space fantasy stuff is just so much fun to play with, and the political system of it with the military stuff and the pirates and all that stuff is a lot of fun, and the religious system is set. It's a great thing, and I'm having a lot of fun doing my first draft of it, which is night and day from how I was feeling about my desert fantasy. And so that's why I wanted to make this video. First, just to announce what is happening and for you to expect sometime in the next week the first vlog of my space fantasy writing process, but also just to encourage you that if you are really struggling with your draft at any point, doesn't have to be during Nano, it can be at any point, you might want to sit down and assess like what it is that you're struggling with. Is it just that you're low energy or stressed and there's like external factors that make it hard to write? Maybe that's all it is. For instance, I was sick all of last weekend, so I couldn't write at all on my new space fantasy, but I knew the space fantasy was still the proper project because I wanted to write it. I tried multiple times to sit down and write it, but I felt too sick to be able to write. So that might be the case with you. But if what you're feeling is dreading putting in the writing, you're not having fun with the drafting, you're not thinking about the book outside of drafting time, if that's what you're feeling, the project might not be ready. It might be time to set it aside and think about a new project, and that is okay. So thank you guys so very much for watching. As always, there are links in my description to causes that really need your support. So I would appreciate you clicking on those and checking them out. You can also support my channel by subscribing, liking the video, all of that stuff. And I look forward to chatting with y'all in the comments.